With ratings approaching single figures and the coffers so low, they actually got a letter from the electricity board threatening to cut off their power supply, and that's not a joke, it really happened. Something had to be done to save both TV-am and the face of ITV, who commissioned the damn thing in the first place. And so the hapless Peter J was given his marching orders after just 7 weeks on air. His replacement as chief executive? Shareholder Jonathan Aitken MP, entering phase 2 of his storied history with ITV. Phase 1 being a brief stint as presenter of Yorkshire's Calendar, and I'm not making that up either. Aitken immediately ran the changes by firing Peter J's allies, Anna Ford and Angela Rippon, for having minds of their own. In an amusing and famous footnote, Aitken and Ford's paths crossed again at a party sometime later, and she took the opportunity of putting her side of the argument forward by chucking a glass of wine right in his stupid Tory face. But let's not be churlish, he might be a perjuring, arms-dealing Tory arsehole, but Jonathan Aitken genuinely did turn around the fortunes of TV-am, with the simple sword of lowbrow entertainment and the trusty shield of the British middle class. Aitken's key appointment was jolly bold man Greg Dyke, soon to become one of the BBC's best director-generals ever, but at the time plying his trade as a producer on end of the peer network LWT. Under Dyke, the legend of TV-am started to fall into place, as Rippon and Ford were replaced with Anne Diamond and Nick Owen, and most importantly of all, as Dyke figured out that kids were likely to be watching in the mornings, especially on school holidays, a large puppet rat named Roland. Other innovations included Wincy Willis and reading out the bingo numbers from the daily press. Slowly, the ratings started to rise, but the company was still seriously strapped for cash. Greg Dyke's ingenious solution was to abandon the studios for the summer and take TV-am on the road. These summer specials, and I'm aware that this is actually from an Australian bicentennial celebration many years later, but it was all I could find, turned out to be the most successful programmes TV-am had made and shown so far, which admittedly wasn't saying much, with the ratings finally starting to catch up and even almost overtake those of BBC Breakfast Time. Not all the cost-cutting measures were quite as successful, of course. One of the first casualties of TV-am was Daybreak, which was initially reduced from Robert Key in a bustling newsroom to an anonymous newsreader in front of a blue screen, before being dropped altogether as TV-am started broadcasting half an hour later. And then, of course, there was the news. TV-am, as previously mentioned, had its own news service, and a partnership with ITN was out of the question. Usually they got away with it because, in general, coming to TV-am for news was like coming to Ali Dia for football advice. But occasionally, it couldn't be avoided. For example, when the IRA attacked the entire United Kingdom government as one in a hotel in Brighton in 1984, 20 months into TV-am's existence. The BBC and ITN, although they weren't broadcasting at the time, were there with reporters, cameras and soundmen to capture the carnage and the intense disappointment that Margaret Thatcher had escaped unharmed. TV-am were there too, with John Stapleton in a phone box. But essentially these were just the last few milk teeth coming through, and as 1984 dawned, TV-am was firmly entrenched as the fruit and fibre accompaniment of choice for the lower middle classes and working class people with aspirations. The final piece of the puzzle for TV-am's eventual world domination came in 1984 with a new face, and at Cup Towers, the sweaty, rubbery one of Kerry Packer, the Australian television and magazine tyrant and Australia's richest man until Rupert Murdoch came along to do exactly what Kerry Packer was doing, only even more ruthlessly. For reasons of his own, Packer decided to buy into TV-am, gaining enough of an interest to be able to appoint his own chief executive, TV-am's fourth in just 15 months on air. Packer's man was fellow dot-eyed Australian Bruce Gyngell, who was already a legend on Australian television, having been there from the very start, having spoken the immortal words, "Good evening and welcome to television," on Australia's first proper TV broadcast. After Peter J, Jonathan Aitken and Timothy Aitken, who was Jonathan's cousin, and stepped in at the last minute when Jonathan remembered he was still supposed to be an MP, Gyngell was the fourth man in charge of TV-am, although his title was Managing Director, and as it turned out, the last, as Gyngell stayed until the bitter end, and given his enormous capacity for stubbornness, would probably still be there now, even though he died nearly 10 years ago. Gidgel made an immediate impact with his first proclamation that the budget be slashed even lower, which led to Greg Dyke, a man who in many ways is Gidgel's opposite, buggering off to TVS, then just about to enter their Hollywood excess phase. Apart from that, though, Gidgel's first few years in charge of TV-am were relatively uneventful, with the most earth-shaking changes being the departure of Roland Rat to the BBC, and the rise of preternaturally chirpy Lorraine Kelly, and the faintly unsettling mustachioed Mike Morris, a man who always seemed like the man for Next All But One had somehow wandered into a television studio by mistake and was only dimly aware that the cameras were wrong. Another new innovation in the early days of Gidgel's reign was the Wide Awake Club, an attempt to actually properly do some kiddie programming, rather than just sticky and incongruous puppet in the middle of Good Morning Britain, initially fronted by Tommy Boyd as a sort of trying too hard stepfather type.
The good news keeps coming in. Here's a letter from Bromley in Kent.
The undisputed star was Mr. Timmy Mallett, and that really is his name, incidentally. With his spin-off series, Whackaday, which came across something like the regular Wide Awake Club with its bum hanging out, Mallett positioned himself as king of the early mornings for an entire generation of children, including myself.
And what's the best thing about the summer holidays? It is, of course, Whackaday on your telly every single day for an hour a day, which is utterly brilliant. Now, all your favourite usual stuff. We've got Mallett's Mallet coming on. Da-da-da! Ouch! We've also got Manic...
Of course, now he seems impossibly grating, not to mention spookily reminiscent of Doctor Who, as played by David Tennant. But you really couldn't fault the man's energy, and besides, of course he seems grating now. Yeah, you're an adult. But he ain't performing for you, you miserable git. And if you actually happened to be the age that Timmy was acting, then he was, as he would have put it, utterly brilliant. The man was a hero during my single figures. I'd probably learned more from Timmy Mallett than I did at primary school. One edition in 1991, during his Whack Africa tour, had him in Kenya demonstrating precisely what the equator was by finding a village that was more or less bisected by it, and, not satisfied with the usual water swirling the other way thing, effectively demonstrated how the equator works by getting some accommodating villagers to stand on either side of it, with the four on the side where it was supposedly summer pretending to sunbathe, and the other four shivering and chattering their teeth because on their side it was technically winter. You can't not respect a man who can get 8 Masaris to mime the seasons for a children's television programme. Plus, for a child who was only dimly aware of what Somerset was, it was a real eye-opener. So there you have it, the case for the defence. Timmy Mallett was brilliant. If you don't think so, you're wrong. Mind you, even I couldn't defend Bomba Marina. It's like your dad down a disco. Anyway, by 1987, TV-am was somewhere no one in March 1983 would have expected. Still broadcasting. Not only that, but by now it was beating the BBC at its own game. So much so that the BBC eventually threw in the towel and conceded the bottom end of the market to the commercial broadcaster, changing breakfast time what Peter J had thought it was going to be all along and unsuccessfully tried to copy, i.e. glossy pornography for superior yuppies. But TV-am being TV-am, this state of affairs, i.e. superiority, couldn't last.
Managements like this spread like a disease amongst industry, not just the broadcasting and entertainment industries, but industries generally.
Industrial action. Have you forgotten how good it tastes?